So without further ado, I will introduce David. We talked a bit, I guess a few months ago now, with some of the COVID stuff and then Jeremy coming over. This talk has been delayed a little bit, but David's over at CSIRO's Data 61 lab, leads the material robotics team, has some really cool papers actually. I think you've got a Nature paper as well, which is very cool. So I think this talk will be really interesting. And yeah, without further ado, please welcome David Howard.
It's really fun to be here in front of actual people. How good. I'd like to thank everyone for coming, especially Sue. So, interesting story about Sue. Sue was my program director when all of this research was happening. And without her support, I would not be the leader of the material robotics team, and none of this work would have happened. So it's very, very important when you're doing work, you have people who believe in you. Feel good story. What did Sue? Round of applause to everyone. So there's going to be no physicality, I hope. I hope we don't get too rowdy. Thanks, Max Kelson, for the pizzas and the beers, by the way. Let's try and control ourselves a little bit. What I want to talk to you today about is a little bit of philosophy, not too much, it's the evening. We can calm down. A little bit of robotics and how it all ties into AI, and how there is a particular French philosopher that I have a bit of a beef with. He's way more interesting than I, but you know, he's dead, so it doesn't matter. So CSIRO is where I work. CSIRO is your Australia's national science agency, and we're pretty big, we're quite well dispersed. We do all kinds of different research. This is a slightly dated photo. This is ICRA 2018, and I like it because we've all got these matching shirts. Again, thanks, Sue. And it gives you this real sense of cohesion, right? So our team is about 50, 60 people with PhD students, postdocs, etc. We go to about 100. We do all kinds of really interesting stuff. So SLAM is kind of our bread and butter. We do LiDAR SLAM, we do stereo vision, etc. We do SLAM++, where basically we can kind of colorize point clouds and do interesting things with that. We do multi-robot teams, and we're starting to get into human-robot teams as well. We do bespoke hardware, which is kind of me, and that's what we'll be talking about. Machine learning all over the shop, lots of 3D printing, multimodal sensing. There's no way I can possibly go into all of the cool stuff we do. If you're interested, let me know, and I can just take you a tour of the facility or send you a slide deck specifically discussing what the group does. Yeah, so my team's material robotics, and this is a really good time. I'm kind of glad that the talk got postponed a bit because we had a couple of papers under review. They've now been accepted, and so I'm free to talk about them. And I was kind of hoping that would happen because I'd have to push it back a bit anyway. So it works out very, very well. What are we going to talk about? Obviously, embodied cognition. So who of you have heard of embodied cognition and you practice embodied cognition? I know you do, Will. It's cheating. Talk about its role in AI, where it fits into the general AI that you will probably be a little bit more familiar with, and how we can use in principles of philosophy and some of the mechanisms of embodied cognition to design robots. Two specific use cases here. One of them that we did with an adaptive morphology, so a robot that can change its shape as it walks, and another one in soft robotics, and I'll explain that when I have to. Boo! Who's this guy? Yes, he thinks, therefore he is. This is Rene Descartes. He is the Frenchman of which I have a particular beef. In fact, his philosophy is very, very relevant to this talk. He says, I think, therefore I am. The only necessity of me being a person, an entity, is that I have a brain, is that I think. And if you think about AI as a whole, right, most of what AI as a whole is this guy. It's software, it's on a computer. There is no physical presence of your machine learning model. When you train a neural network, it's electrons fizzing around circuits, right? There's no physical presence to be had, with some small exceptions. So when Rene Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, that's kind of what AI is now. It's software. We train models, we throw data at it, it gives us a regression, a classification, something. Right? But it's not here. It's not physical. And the other way of doing it is embodied cognition. And it's very important to state that this stands in complete contrast to Descartes and Cartesian dualism. Okay? So what embodied cognition is saying is, yeah, we have a brain. Sure, Rene, we have a brain. Okay, I will accept that. But we also have a body. We have a morphology. We have hands and feet, fingers. We have eyes, ears. We have different ways of sensing and interacting with our environment. And that's the third point, right? The environment. The environment is how we produce behavior. Our brain and our body control each other in a way, and I hope that I'll be able to show you this fairly convincingly as we move through the talk. So the brain and the body, that's us. The environment is this, and there is a strong physicality to embodied cognition. It's real stuff, right? So yeah, you may have gathered from the accent, come from England, and hence my favorite weather is rain. Yeah, but not because it gets me wet. It's because I can feel it. Yeah, it's physical. I was trying to figure out why I liked rain over sunshine. I probably shouldn't have moved to Brisbane given that. However, here we are. So embodied cognition is basically that. It is the fact that there's a body, it's coupled to the brain, both of them are coupled to the environment, and through interactions between the three, we can get behavior. The biological roots of embodied cognition. So this is where it came from. This is a chicken. It's a very large, high-resolution chicken. And what I'm going to show you through the next few slides is basically some ideas about body-brain coupling and body-brain environment coupling, and showing how this is how nature does it. Okay, so just have to bear that in mind. So the chicken, in many ways, is a fantastic beast. Slightly small on the cranial front, however. The chicken has evolved in a certain way, right? Where when it wants to move forward, well, let's put it a different way. When I move forward, I can continually process visual information, right? It's a continuous stream of information. So I can just walk over here. The chicken cannot. And if you'll forgive my impression of a chicken, when it walks, it does this. Right? Its head is moving. Its head moves to a fixed point, and then its body catches up. And that's because it can't continually process visual information. Check these guys out. See? Ludicrous. These chickens are holding their heads static because their visual circuits cannot process a continuous visual stream. So when a chicken runs, it moves its head forward to a point, its body catches up, but its head is static, and that's what gives it a continuous perception, a visual perception of the world. So this is the way that the chicken has figured out to move around the world. We, when we are born, have specific limits put on how we can move our bodies by our brain. And it's a way of bootstrapping learning, right? When you're a baby, you can only move both of your arms at the same time. How frustrating. You can't move a single arm. You have to move both at the same time. Your legs, you have to move both at the same time. That's the way we're wired up. What it does is it gives you a very reduced, let's say, in terms of learning, a state space, right? So the baby is free to explore and learn in a vastly reduced state space of its morphology. And later on, when it gets a bit more intelligent, it figures out, oh, what I can do with two arms. It can then move each arm individually, right? And its hands, it can only do this. And then it can do it like that. But that's actually an incredibly useful thing to be able to do. Because all babies want to do is pick things up and put them in their mouths, right? That's how babies learn, and that is how they do it. And in fact, we as adult humans have very specific things that we can do with our hands. So our hands are all kind of jointed the same kind of way, right? But we can only move them in very specific ways because we don't need to move them in other ways. So the body and the brain are linked up, and together they're giving us behaviors. There's some things we can do, there's things we can't do. This is an octopus. And octopuses are perhaps the preeminent example of embodied cognition. The octopus has a brain inside its skull area. However, 2/3 of its neurons are distributed down its arms, right? What does that mean? Well, it means that an octopus's arms are incredibly complicated, right? There's all of these little suckers, it can independently control them. It can move in a continuous fashion. So like when we talk about robot arms, we're talking about rigid links, right? Rigid links are relatively easy to control. A kind of soft creature like this that has no bones, right? It has no bones in its arms. It can move its arms in whichever way it wants. And the only way it can do that is by having its sensing, its neurons in its arms. Its arms can locally control themselves and be directed by the brain, okay? I don't work for Netflix. However, I must say, if you haven't seen My Octopus Teacher, I advise you to do so. It's about an hour long, and it's about this guy in South Africa that goes diving and basically falls in love with an octopus. Consensually. I mean, they hug at points. It's fine, it's all PG. But the octopus, right, is doing all of these amazing things. And I won't spoil the end game of this documentary, but there is an end game to this documentary when it shows you just what this octopus can do. What I've shown here is a defensive posture adopted by the octopus, where it's picking up shells and rocks and sucking them to its body and then hiding behind them so it can't be eaten. This is embodied cognition. The brain is telling the body is using the environment. All three of them are working together to generate behavior. Now, there was a very famous experiment, and I thought I might relate this a bit to humans, where there was a class taking a test, and unbeknownst to them, half of that class was taking test A and half of them were taking test B. So they're taking different tests, right? And test A was all the questions were about youth and virility and speed, right? And all of test B was about growing old and dying, being frail and horrible. And the point of the test wasn't how well they did. The point of the test was to prime, their brains were priming their bodies. And the experiment was that those people would then sit up, get out of their seats and move to a predefined location on campus. The ones that had been doing test A, the youthful test, got there much, much faster than those who were doing test B. See, the brain influences the body influences the brain. They all act in the environment. So, in short, EC, embodied cognition. It's a close coupling of the environment, the body, and the brain. The idea is that the mind is grounded by a physical experience, our interactions with the environment, a la reinforcement learning. Our body is altered by the mind state. And both of these occur in a physical space through physical interaction, as opposed to most AI models on a computer. But when we're solving physical problems, and that's moving it into robotics now, so when we're solving physical problems with a physical robot, surely it makes sense to have a look at embodied cognition and see if there's anything it can teach us. If we could get a robot to do what an octopus could do, we would have solved most of robotics, right? But we can't. What we can do is take inspiration from it and influence some of those mechanisms, okay? So, embodied cognition in a robot. And again, just remembering body, brain, environment all together. I do need to put a disclaimer in here. So this is the one of the, well, two of the robots, in fact, that our group uses to compete in the DARPA Robotics Challenge. And these robots are, in a sense, embodied. They're physically there in the environment. However, they are not an example of embodied cognition. Their bodies are not adapting to the environment. Okay? So that's a distinction. You can be an embodied robot. That means you are a robot with a physical presence. You are really there. And that in itself is really, really good. Because if a robot is simulated, then it can't do anything useful in reality. So this is a robot doing something useful in reality. What we're talking about with embodied cognition is the ability to adapt, okay, as we go. And here's some examples of why embodied cognition might be useful to us as a robotic designer, as roboticists, as AI practitioners. When I was filling in the abstract for this talk, I did promise a number of things to you. I'm aware of that. And one of them is this quote at the top by me. How viewing robotics problems through the lens of embodied cognition provides unconventional robot designs for unpredictable operating environments. So this is what I'm going to try and give you in this part of the talk. Why is EC useful for robots? Well, simply enough, if we can put some of the smarts of our robots into the body, the controllers we need to write for those robots become simpler. They become more robust. We can do more with a more intelligent behavior, right? We're not just relying on our neural network controller or whatever controller to be the smarts. We are saying the body has a role as well. The body can provide some of these solutions. The passive dynamic walker is a very extreme example, okay, and may not be regarded as embodied cognition depending on how extreme you go, but it does illustrate a point. This thing can walk on its own with no motors and no control. It's like a pendulum system, right? But if you put that on a robot, your robot is able to walk on some types of ground for free. You don't need to control it, right? So your controller can be much simpler. Your body is solving the problem. The other thing that we know is that if we do a tighter coupling between the robot and its environment, we tend to get better results across the board, right? And if you consider it as a design problem for any designers out there, it gives us more variables in our design space. We can consider the robot, the body, as well as the control. And also, you know, like I said, it's the way nature does it. Nature, I think we can agree, nature and evolution together have given us some pretty special environmentally fit agents. And if robotics are environmentally fit agents, then that's a way to look at the problem, right? But how do we design these embodied cognition systems? We need an embodiment designer. And the point of this picture is to show that the designs that we come up with might not be the ones that an engineer would come up with. The designs that we come up with through our automated machine learning algorithms might be very alien, very strange. And we typically, because we're interested in an agent interacting with an environment, there's two real paradigms in artificial intelligence, specifically in machine learning, part of artificial intelligence, that we can look at. The first one is reinforcement learning. The agent repeatedly interacts with the environment, gets some reward. The other one is evolutionary design, which is very similar to reinforcement learning. In evolutionary algorithms, we have a population of individuals. They go and interact in an environment and receive some notion of fitness in a Darwinian sense, right? So like a survival of the fittest, we just give them a numerical measure. Say, you're good at walking forwards, you're good at jumping over bars, or whatever. And so by rewarding the bits of behavior that we want, we can train these agents to give us those behaviors, right? And it's a coupling of the body and the brain. It's the robot plus the controller that we're rewarding. And because the fitness is coming from the environment, this is kind of a natural coupling to evolutionary, to embodied cognition. And it's kind of this automated designer as well. So what does that look like? Well, there has been some work, this is purely simulated, but what it shows us is the ability for evolution to design embodiments that are useful. So what we've got is a robot made up of voxels, 3D pixels, and evolution, our machine learning algorithm, is allowed to say which voxels of a cube, a larger cube, have material in them, and which of those occupied voxels have what type of material, you know, contracting muscle and expanding muscle, a soft structure, a bone-like structure. And we can iteratively evolve, air quotes, these behaviors, right? So this one's walking. We didn't tell it to walk. We said, go from here to here as fast as possible. But you can see some quite natural looking behaviors, right? And some weirdness, obviously. And this is what I mean by that black and white sketch, right? The designs that it comes up with are not necessarily engineered designs. They are designs that an algorithm in its bias-free bliss has constructed for us. So this is a graph that shows the number of iterations on the bottom and how well it travels fast at going up the y-axis, sorry. And then you can see the different patterns of the voxels in the animal, and you can see the different distribution of the tissue and the muscle virtual through the robot. And you can see it's just getting better and better and better. And that's because we're selecting ones that have given us decent behavior in the past, and we're creating things that are a little bit like them using digital versions of kind of crossover mutations. So we can imagine these creatures can be represented by a string of numbers, right? It's fairly easy to see that we can do that. And then by mutating them, we change some of those numbers a little bit. By crossing them over, we might take two parents who are quite good, perform like digital sexual reproduction and switch parts of their genomes over so they're shared into the next generation. So we did this with robot legs. So actually the important thing is that there was no control involved in that. So that was, again, without control. That's just the body materials giving you locomotion behavior. We did some work at CSIRO where we wanted, so the problem was we have these hexapod robots, right? And they're quite good Swiss Army knives. They can go on different types of terrains, reasonably okay. But some types of terrains really drain their batteries. They cause lots of different slips and stuff like that. So what I thought was, well, what if we had like little toolkits of legs that we could snap onto the hexapods for different terrains? So what we do is we have like a population of different legs, and then we have a simulator at the top right. And what the simulator's doing is it's telling us how efficient that leg is at moving through different types of material. And what we then do is we could 3D print the legs, stick them on the robot, and the robot can go on. So it's like a little interchangeable specialization toolkit. Right? And it worked pretty well. So the cool thing was we had 3 different types of environment here. So we had like a soil environment, we had a granular pebbles, I guess, environment, and we had a water environment as well. And evolution automatically designed very, very different types of legs for those environments. Without me, as you know, I'm a software engineer, without me needing to know the engineering necessarily behind how to design those legs. It did it in a very natural, emergent kind of fashion. So that's cool. For the second part of this talk, what I'd like to go into is, in a bit more depth, some of the embodied cognition work that we've done at CSIRO. There's 2 specific case studies that I'd like to look at. And the first one is, I need to talk about Tonners first. So Tonners, Nygaard there, we met over a beer at an evolutionary computing conference back in the days where we could travel internationally. I shed a small tear every time I think about it. Tunners was quite an interesting character. So he comes from Oslo. He's just finished his PhD, just graduated his PhD. And his work was on, as a mechanical engineer who liked evolution. And that's really rare. You don't really find mechanical engineers into evolution too much. So what he did was he has this robot that he's designed himself. And the robot can change the length of its legs. Okay, sounds simple. It's the first one ever. This guy's PhD project, pretty cool. So we were discussing over a beer in Japan, and we decided it would be a very good idea if he were to come to Brisbane for 6 months and do some work with his PhD supervisors and myself. And this is kind of what we did. This is 6 months of work, and he was telling me these stories. He packed his robot up in a case, took it through customs, and they were like, what the hell is this? But he got it through, so it's good. Here's the robot. This is called Dyret, and I only realized 2 weeks ago that Dyret in Norwegian means the animal. Dyret, sorry. I'm horribly English. I'm sorry. So, say again. The robot has a number of sensors. It is a robot, right? We've got sensors, we've got actuators. It has 4 sensors on its feet, and it has a depth camera that shows kind of like the roughness of the terrain it's about to walk over. And it has this adaptive chassis where it can change the length of its legs. And then we have a very simple controller for its gait where we generate like a curve, and its foot, it follows the curve. So this video might be a little long. I might just skip a bit. So here it is, walking around in the wild, let's say. And here it is, changing the length of its legs. It's got these kind of screws go up and down. And it's quite an impressive thing for a PhD student to have created. And obviously I saw this and was like, hey, let's do some embodied cognition. So we did. There's a couple of experiments that we did. The first one was, robot walks along in some kind of boxes that we made. So we got like some deliveries, truckloads of gravel and sand and stuff, and dumped them on site, and then we made little terrain boxes and walked the robot up and down them. And it's basically to pre-train a model. So in the left-hand side, what you can see is the robot's walking along, and it detects, exclamation mark, that something has changed, either from the sensors on its feet or the depth sensor that it has. So RGBD. It looks into its model and finds the best morphology to changes into that morphology, and then carries on. And this was kind of our calibration/model building experiment. Then in the second one, we let it loose in the wild. And this was the, when I say like world first, this was the world first bit, letting it go outside and do stuff outside. So when it's going outside, it's constantly sampling its sensors and seeing if it needs to change. And it's, you can see it as it's walking along, it moves up and down with its legs. So these are the terrain boxes. And so without going into it too much, in figure B, figure B, the green line is the best morphology for gravel. So we walked it around in a load of different morphologies on loads of different terrains. It was like, what is the best morphology? And when I say best, I mean most energy efficient. So we use something called cost of transport, which relates the robot's mass, its forward speed, and its energy consumption, which we can just measure up the servos.
David, was this trained in a simulator before you set it out in the wild?
Oh no, this was full hardware. So training in a simulator would have required quite the model. And also, if we were in the simulator, to transfer it out to reality, we'd need to cross the sim to real gap. So if you train something in a simulator, the physics isn't the same as reality, obviously. And crossing that gap, you can get decreased performance. So we just thought we'd do it all in hardware, which was a really good idea, apart from if your tonners sat there with his straw hat on at 2 in the afternoon, 38 degrees, bottle of water, you know. But you know, that's how you get PhDs. That's how you get PhDs. So it's fine. It's fine. Yeah. So yeah, this is full hardware. It's all done in hardware. It does have a model on board of its performance, but it's not like a physics-based model. It's not running a simulator. Right. So in the graph, we can see the green line. The green line is the best morphology for gravel. And when we set it off on concrete, obviously it's not that good. And then it moves to gravel and it becomes the best. Vice versa, the orange line is the best one on concrete. So it's really good at concrete. When it moves to gravel, it gets worse. And then we just show that we can switch between the two, you know, very simple stuff. And the blue line is what happens when we switch between the two. So lower numbers are better here, cost of transport. Low cost of transport is more efficient. And then what we did is we took it outside in Brisbane, in sub-figure C, and we sort of moved it around between a road, which is kind of concrete, which it had seen before, and grass, which it had not seen before. And having a constantly variable morphology, it's constantly varying and updating its model parameters, was far better than any single static morphology. So when we are designing this robot, we can confidently say, we can confidently say that harnessing embodied cognition made this robot better. Okay. So we can go a little bit into it. So we kind of discretized the lengths of the legs. So each leg had two bits that we could change the length of. And we could then kind of say, what is the best cost of transport, exhaustively searching all of these. And this is kind of like pre-training a model, right? So we pre-train our model where the lower cost of transport is better again. So basically the lighter colors are better. And you can see that they're, you know, across concrete and sand and gravel, there isn't really an overall winner. There's a zone which is reasonably good, but there are individual bits which are better. And what we let it do then is we let it pick. So if it starts on concrete, we'll set it in the middle, and then it will, after every 6 seconds or so, it will decide, do I want to change my morphology or not? And it will be able to move to any of its immediate neighbors. And then it can just keep doing that forever. So this is the cool thing where we saw it on grass. So on grass, so this is cost of transport ever, right? So that is how confident is the model in its prediction. And obviously it hasn't seen grass before, so it's not very sure at the start, and then it very, very quickly learns a good cost of transport. And then the graphs at the bottom in black and white, they're just showing the number of times each of those places was visited, each morphology was sampled and used. So what this shows is that the robot kind of adapts itself to unseen terrains based on knowledge that it has of a few different terrains, which we picked very deliberately to have different properties so that the model would interplay between them. So that's the first one. And the second one is in soft robotics. Who knows what a soft robot is? Soft robot. Cool, all right. So soft robots they're kind of a new thing. I mean, they've been around since the 70s, 80s, but nowadays they're getting really good. A soft robot is basically deformable, flexible, bendable. You know, I hate to say big hero, but yeah, it's that kind of thing. Right? So it's soft. The robot is soft. It's a soft robot. Soft robots are very, very good for a number of reasons, because they can deform, because they can bend, they can comply. They're very, very adaptable in a load of different environments. They don't break very much. Like, they can just sort of deform, stretch, instead of just breaking like a hard robot might. And they're human safe. They're very easy to work around humans. So that's the good bit. And the bad bit is that they're very hard to design, They're very hard to model, and they're very hard to control. But other than that, they're such a good research field. I enjoy working in it. It's certainly a challenge. But they are really interesting as a research problem because there's so many things, so many domains that they can have an impact in. If you go from like disaster response, like getting things in small tracks with oxygen sensors, or, you know, medical, getting flexible human-safe robots inside the body. These are all really, really strong use cases for soft robots. And we also use them a lot for gripping and manipulation. If you think about a rigid robot hand with a multiple joints. I mean, it wouldn't be as complex as my hand, right? It would have a few different joints in it, but you still need to control those joints to grip something, right? The grippers that I'm going to show you now, you don't need to do that. Control is purely binary, and the control is purely binary because the body, the morphology, is so good. So what we're talking about is granular jamming. Granular jamming has its own field of physics. It's incredibly complex. It's very, very hard to explain, but it's to do with the forces between lots of small particles that interact with each other. They don't have to be small, in this case they're small. And traditionally, what we'd do is we would have a balloon, a party balloon, we'd fill it with coffee grounds, we'd put a filter on it, and then we'd use a vacuum pump. And what happens is, you can imagine that the balloon would deform. I was going to do this as a live demo, but then I chickened out. So you can imagine that the balloon would deform around various different objects without knowing how to grip them, right? It doesn't know how to grip them. It just deforms around different types of objects. And then when you pull the vacuum, the granular material stops acting like a movable fluid, and it acts as a rigid solid with high friction. It grips stuff, and you can pick all kinds of different things up. And it's called universal gripping. So it's this vacuum-based technology. But the issue is, people use like coffee or rice. And when I see coffee and rice, I see a load of grains that I don't have control over. But I do have control over the grains. So what we can do is we can pose this as a problem whereby I can evolve grains for specific gripping problems, right? So this is we've got a polyjet printer. I can give you the details later if you want. But basically what it does is it lets us print soft stuff, and it lets us print hard stuff, and it lets us print soft stuff and hard stuff together. We can do part in part. We can do soluble support material. So there's a whole load of different stuff we can do. And on the bottom, you can see a load of grains that we have on the print bed. So this, again, is down to one of my wonderful, dedicated research associates who comes along, prints 1,000 grains, cleans them up. It's a thankless task, but it is a paid task. And what we're doing is we're looking at the shape of grains, right? The shape of the grains should have an influence on the performance of the gripper. And we have this representation called a superquadric, and the formula's there if you're interested about it. It doesn't really matter. The point is we can get all kinds of weird and wacky shapes out of this formula by changing the numbers of the formula, right? So we can change M, A, B, C, and by solving it, it gives us different shapes. Right? And these are the numbers that could go into a genetic algorithm. When we can change the numbers in the algorithm, it changes the shape, and then we can test it out. So DEM is discrete element method, and that's what this happy jumble of mess at the bottom is. These are lots of different shapes of grains, and we can simulate their grain-to-grain contacts with incredibly high resolution using CSIRO's DEM solver. So what we're talking about here is bespoke embodied cognition. And we picked four grain shapes that are predicted by our discrete element method model to give us diverse behavior. And we wanted to show, when we put them in a gripper, they do give us diverse behavior. So a really simple hypothesis, but again, not proven. So you can see on the left the grain shapes, and then what we do is we just put them in a balloon, and then we pull it's kind of like a linear rail, or like a Dremel stand, I guess. It's a Dremel stand. And we can pull that down onto a different object, and then we engage the vacuum pump, we pull it up, and we can measure on the load cell, that S-shaped thing at the bottom there, how many newtons of force it required to separate the gripper from the object. So it gives us an idea of how strong that grip is. And there's two things that are pretty cool. The first thing is, so SVE is just the size. So we did 3 different sizes and we did 4 different shapes. So the first thing is that when we explore 4 different objects that we want to pick up, the ideal grain changes. So there is no universal gripper. There are instead multiple separate individual specialized universal grippers for different types of grains. And the other thing is that in the literature, we're talking about things like spheres and cubes are the things that typically get kind of measured. But what we've shown is that when you expand that design space outright, when you really go for like weird and wacky shapes, you get better performance. So being able to use evolution to investigate embodiments has given us grippers that previously did not exist and are better than the state of the art. We can take that a step further, so we can actually evolve them. So here you can see, like I said, we can change the numbers using machine learning. Find the best numbers for X is a very classic machine learning problem. And we can use it to pick up different types of objects. And we can do it in the model, and then we can evaluate it in reality. So evolution can design us these kind of embodied cognition. And we've done lots of other cool stuff as well. So Soft Robotics has just accepted one, and this is the one I was waiting for the acceptance of before I could show it, on one-shot prints. And this is basically, you know, me feeling a little bit sorry for some of my research associates who have to handle lots of coffee grounds and put them into balloons. Like it's quite difficult to do, and we've got a couple of vacuums on site and we use them a lot. We spend a lot of time tidying things up. But what one-shot prints lets us do is print the entire gripper in one go. So the filter, kind of like the rubbery seal attachment, we print that. We print a kind of gridded mesh to prevent the grains from falling back out of the gripper. We print the grains themselves in whatever specification and arrangement we want. And we print the membrane, and again, in whatever specification, material we want. And we then use soluble support, put it in a soluble support bath for a few hours, and it comes out as a gripper which we can use. So it's a one-step fabrication process, judged by my definition of one step. It's a one-step fabrication process. So it lets us do loads of really cool things. And at the top, you can see we've got a deformation, which is we'll call a program deformation. So basically, we can put structures into the membrane, make it twist around, and it picks up different types of objects. Here you can see kind of patterning. So we've got like ridges, we've got little demispheres which we can pattern around the outside. It's very, very easy to do this with 3D printing. It's very, very hard to do this with casting and molding. And if we think about evolving these things, we can print 80 of these in one go on a print bed. So we can have really big generations, big search spaces, and we can build models of them as well. And the other thing we can do is we can do paws. Instead of hands, we can do feet. So the program deformation stuff's pretty cool. And again, this is sort of a world first. Jamming grippers are pretty bad at picking up coins, apart from if you print the membrane so that it twists around the coin, and then you can do that, which is pretty cool. And the other thing that we have are these, hang on, there we go, these paws. So again, this is about putting some of the intelligence from the controller and pushing it into the body and distributing it through the robot as a whole. So this video shows basically a paw that can, I'll show better on this one actually. Yeah. So this shows a paw that has a jamming component at the bottom there. It has individual toes, which increase friction and stop it sliding. The toes themselves have little tendons on them, so they can go back to a normal position, like a neutral position, without needing to be controlled. There's no control in this foot apart from a binary controller from the vacuum pump. And not only does it allow our legged robots to walk over all kinds of different ground, we can actually manipulate objects using the foot. We don't need a robot arm on the back of the robot. It saves kilograms of payload. It's pretty cool. It also allows us to do things like move obstacles out of the way to move through a space, right? And we're doing all of this with a vacuum pump. And you can see the tendons kind of flexing there, and as the leg lifts up, you can see the tendons pushing the toes back into their default positions. So that's pretty cool. Like, we can do lots of stuff with this soft robotic technology that we haven't been able to do before through a combination of computational design, 3D printing, and kind of giving ourselves over to the notion of embodied cognition. The other cool things that we can do is, because we've got a model, right? We've got a model of these grains and we're really interested in shapes. But when we print them, we're using a layer-based deposition technique. It's a polyjet printer. So the question is, like, how accurate are these shapes? Because we noticed when we printed very, very, very small spheres, they didn't roll like spheres, and that's a problem. Because it means they roll like spheres in a model, they don't roll like spheres in reality. You hit the reality gap effects, and all of a sudden your system you've designed in simulation does not work in reality, and you have a big problem. But what we actually showed is that we get very, very low average deviation. Obviously, this depends on the printer you use. Ours has like an 18 micron resolution, so it's pretty good. 16 micron resolution, correct myself. And what we did is we used a laser scanning microscope and took the grains and just took like line profiles with the laser, and found that we were actually very, very close to the ideal shapes there. So what it means is that we can actually go very, very small with these grains, and small grains have distinct advantages in some scenarios. For example, shock absorbance. Just thought I'd put this in here to show, like, I really like this image. It's all over my presentations. But yeah, you can see the kind of layer-based effect. So this is a 4 millimeter ellipsoidal grain, blue ellipsoidal grain. And you can see how rough it is, right? And then from the image on the left, you can see how rough it is. But it's actually very, very close to the ideal shape. So, to conclude, I really like embodied cognition. Did you get that from the right? So, I think it's a really, really interesting way to think about problems, and not just problems in like robotics, but any AI problem with a physical system in it, right? If you consider the physical nature of the physical system, you can do more with that problem. You can solve it in different ways, right? And what we've been trying to do is think about frameworks that let us explore how we can bring in materials and components and robots and get these natural looking products coming out. And it's all from the notion that, nature's been doing it a certain way for a very long time, probably knows what it's doing. And there's a small but tight-knit community, I'd say, of researchers that sort of follow this vision, and it's growing. But the notion that we can combine, materials into morphologies, into machines, and then have a simple controller running over the top allows us to tackle more complex problems. Some recommended reading if you're interested. I mean, the Pfeiffer-Bongard book was really the one that increased the academic kind of reach of embodied cognition. It was the one that I read first, it got me hooked. It's very, very, very compelling notions of the power of embodied cognition, I guess. And the other one that is really interesting is Margaret Wilson has a paper called 6 Views of Embodied Cognition, and goes into quite a lot of depth about the philosophy, I guess, and how we can prove and disprove different notions of embodiment. So, I mean, you can read the slide. I think it's a really interesting field because it's a form of physical AI. And because of that, you're not just limited to software engineers and data miners. You've got material scientists, mechatronics, electronics, all kinds of different people, different skill sets, people that can design, you know, forming these really nice, rich, multidisciplinary teams. And it's really exciting to be working at that in CSIRO. But I guess my final thought is that robots should be more like an octopus. And if they can do that, then we'll be in good shape in the future. I'd just like to thank the team. So this is a collection, a motley crew. Josh, thanks for coming, mate. And so when I say like a multidisciplinary team, I mean we have all kinds of different backgrounds here, and we all combine to make something pretty special, I think. So yeah, thanks for listening. I hope that was exciting.
Thank you, David. We'll start some questions, and I might actually ask the first one. So this is a two-part question. One, how inspired is embodied cognition, this field, from psychology and philosophy? You mentioned Descartes earlier, and obviously some of the other research on the human body. I'm curious, how much of an influence that has had. And secondly, if we look to the future, what are some of the problems in the next 5 to 10 years that particularly soft robotics, where we're going to need to embrace that? Is grasping, which is still a really hard problem, going to be one of those? What does the future look like?
Well, okay, so to answer the first bit of the question, embodied cognition was very much, I would say, a purely philosophical field for a very long time. There were demonstrators, for example, there's one called iBot, which is one of the really early ones, where they showed basically how, again, creatures with small brains, like a fly, tiny little brain, devolves its processing out into its body, specifically the arrangement of photoreceptors on its eyes. And in doing that, it linearizes all of its control inputs. It makes it super simple to control, so a fly's brain can control it. So there have been some physical kind of instantiations, but only recently. I mean, the tricky thing is that it's hard to build these things, right? And until 3D printing, there really wasn't a good way to do it. Some of the pioneering work was done using Lego technique. That was the extent of the toolkit that we had. But now that we have things like printing and all of these different additive subtractive manufacturing techniques, and they're accessible and, air quotes, cheap, we can actually start to employ those mechanisms to design physical things. And yes, soft robotics is a great example of one of those things where, there are no codified design algorithms for these things. The soft robots themselves, if they're fully soft, then they have infinite degrees of freedom. How do you control it? They're very, very difficult to model. They're often hyper-elastic, and if you talk to Josh later, he can rant about how difficult these things are to model and design. So there's a lot of unsolved questions there. And in terms of the applications, I think what we're talking about medical. I think medical is a really good one. I think being able to grasp, and not just with soft, right? There is definitely a place for rigid robots. They're very, very precise, very, very repeatable. I think there's a combination of them is going to help us, specifically if you think about things like Industry 4, where we have smarts in the machines that are driving the industry. And again, you can talk to Will about the Arm Hub, who knows all about these things more than I do. But yeah, I think soft robots is going to be a generally revolutionary step, and it's a field that is still coming out of its infancy, so there's huge impact still to be had there.
I was in the Philippines about 15 years ago, and we're traveling between a whole bunch of islands in a little classical outrigger, and we went through a pod of jellyfish, and I, in broken English, kind of got to talking to the driver. I said, why were the jellyfish there? He said, every time there's a storm out at sea, they all come to this spot. And I'd always told that story as a story of how intelligence was, jellyfish have two neurons and can probably sense pressure and they navigate their way there. But it sounds like that's a story about embodied cognition.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both, right? So the only difference is you consider the environment. What is it? Or is it something simple and reactive, right? I mean, there's lots to be said about reactive behaviors. Is it that when there's a pressure difference that causes a storm, it forces the jellyfish into that patch of ocean? You know, is it something like that? Is it the environment having more of a factor there? But I guess if I could bestow a single takeaway, it would be like, consider the whole, consider the environment as well. Body, brain, environment, tied together, better behaviors. Right.
Hi, thanks for the talk. If I look at your body, you have got a spinal cord with reflexes, you've got a cerebellum, and then you've got the cortex above your brain. Each of those seems to have a layer that has evolved, so that if you stand there and you put out one arm, your body will automatically balance. If you walk along, you'll swing your arms in a certain pattern. The human brain seems to have a model of the human body within it, and even a model of the human brain. In terms of your robotics, what have you done to sort of embed a model of the robot's body and the capability and opposing muscles, etc., within the model of your robot, and how it moves and what dynamics it's capable of, etc., and laws of physics even?
Good question. So in terms of what we've done, we've focused more on the body design because that's the new frontier that's just opened up. I can talk about a colleague and his work. So what he did was he had a robot, and this is a very famous paper by Josh Bongard, who wrote the book. He had a robot, which was a hexapod robot, so six-legged, rigid. So the physics of rigid are a lot simpler than for soft. So it's a rigid robot. And it's got its own physics simulator of itself on board. And what it does is it moves its leg and it figures out what's happening to my leg in reality, and it uses that to kind of tune its own simulator. Then, you know, I think that's a really interesting thing to think about, especially if you think about the morphologically adaptive one. We wanted to do that. The problem was we had 6 months, and it was like, well, what's the most impactful thing we can give in 6 months in terms of research? But having a self-model means that you can employ things like genetic algorithms, things like reinforcement learning, much, much faster in simulation. And if you have a way of closing the reality gap, so there's a really good paper recently by ETH Zurich where they do this using something called curriculum learning. And they managed to get the gap between the behavior in the simulation, behavior in reality, reasonably close, so that you can then transfer policies directly over. That's kind of the future. It's like, yeah, exactly. So the cool thing about full hardware evolution is that it works in reality. You know, you don't need that step. And if you can get something working in reality, that's where we need robots to be. However, most of the modern learning algorithms are highly parallelizable and really powerful, so we want to be using those as well. And then the question is, how do we get those on board the robot? And we're getting better at being able to do that. You know, the compute power's there. It's just another avenue of research which is open that we can go down.
Oh, I just want to, no, don't give me that. People online. All right, I'm going to use my big boomy voice then. I think the big takeaway that people have to get when they're talking about embodied cognition is that it's a world where cognition can occur without an internal representation. And in fact, your human internal representation of your perception of the world, your decisions, and there's all a bunch of self-justification. All right, if you go deep into the weeds, you do things before you decide to do them, and then you justify the result. So yeah, exploring a world of cognition without a representation going on is I think the big takeaway from this here.
Yeah, and there's a lot of work on how
jellyfish doesn't decide.
Yeah, it's like, well, how reactive are we, right? We like to think that we are in control of our own minds. We have discipline and control, but there are times where we lose that discipline and we lose that control. And some of that is to do with our bodies, our sensory representations, and our bodies can be programmed to take over, to react without our brain being there. It doesn't mean we don't have a representation, but what it means is that our internal representation is shaped by our body, our experiences, our physical experiences as well.
I have something a bit more mundane. I was just interested in the adaptive robot. You mentioned that it had learned experiences across a number of surfaces, and then when it went from one to another, it used an adaptive where it went from one grid to another, which to me is like a two-dimensional gradient descent. Did you have any situations where it made a local min and didn't progress beyond that, and how did you go about getting over that?
We certainly did. So, I mean, it was kind of a problem and kind of not a problem, because we had an element of randomness. So we had the explore exploit thing. So I didn't really explain that too well. But there's an element of randomness in it, so it can hop around anyway. But it's generally heavily guided by exploitation pressure, because it's in reality, it doesn't have much chance to explore around. It could break itself, for example. It didn't break when it was there, which is good, because that would have scuppered everything. But like, it does have that because its sensors are noisy. Because its sensors are noisy, it can get incorrect readings for where its body should be. And then it will go to that body and be like, oh, I haven't been here before, but actually this is really good. So there's an element of random walking, but there's also a lot of element of the sensors themselves being imperfect in a physical imperfect world.
I was going to ask a question about sort of optimality and the philosophical side. So within actual biology and evolution, crabs have evolved from several different species. So they've all evolved into crabs. Are you concerned about having a crab, basically, and just evolving another form of crab?
Well,
like hitting that local maxima that already exists within reality.
Well, I guess there's two ways of looking at it, right? And one of them is that convergence to a crab is bad. But if you're a crab, it's pretty good, because crabs are pretty good in their niches. So it's like, if you want to use evolution as an optimizer, then we might want it to optimize the same thing every time. However, a lot of the work in evolution that I didn't get time to go into is about something called quality diversity. So this is where, instead of having a population where we get to an apex, right, our apex crab, and that's what we've got, and then at the end of the optimization we throw everything else away, we have libraries. We have libraries of stuff that are variously good or bad at different things, and we keep all of them. So our population is actually a population, and the crab's in there, but there's all kinds of other things in there as well. We keep everything we find, and then we can use that to ensure that our population is sufficiently diverse. And the interesting thing is, in a lot of different benchmark problems, when we just optimize for diversity, we get higher performance than if we just optimize for performance. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but the diversity feeds into the algorithm and helps it explore more unconventional solutions. That's ultimately what we want.
Hi, David. It was a really cool talk. I learned a lot about cognitive embodiment. And my question is, with respect to the moving robots, so how much of the decision making is made locally within the robots? And as a follow-up, how much of an impact will the rise of edge computing have on robotics and the movement of robots?
Well, I mean, for edge computing, we're talking about highly resource-constrained devices that are relatively, low power, low bandwidth, passing bits of models between themselves, right? Solving these problems on the edge. So a part of that question goes to like, what are you trying to learn? If you've got a deep neural network that you're trying to learn on the edge, that's where edge computing becomes useful, right? Because you're trying to solve this problem where you've got a resource-hungry training process and you're trying to do it on like a calculator. But the robots that we've got here, they're more, I mean, you could kind of consider it edge computing if you had lots of different robots that are going out and doing stuff. The interesting thing from embodied cognition is that like if we have 5 identical robots and we send them out on the same mission, but they take different paths, their models and experiences will be different, right? They will have different knowledge representations and they can pass those models between themselves. They can do computing at the edge. It's typically the robots that we have though, they're not so resource constrained. So they can run these kind of full learning stacks on board. So they've got like batteries and proper computers and stuff like that. But if you were to take it smaller, then that's when edge would play a significant role. Or a good example of something that we've done in the past is like deploying robots into a rainforest and dropping off sensor nodes, right? So the nodes are doing the edge and they're uploading stuff to the computer when the computer comes past, so kind of data muling of it. So the computer on the large robot comes past, so sort of data muling. So in that case, yeah, edge, very relevant, but for the scales of robots that we're using at the moment, it's not, we can't get the robots small enough yet to actually call it edge computing.
Last question, sorry, David.
Hello. When I'm thinking about embodied cognition, I'm thinking lots of feedback loops and lots of sensory readings. Maybe multiple dimensions more of sensory input versus actuators coming out. Do you do any sort of online learning, or how do you approach?
Well, there's lots of different ways of doing it. So the first thing to note is in a soft robot, you've got infinite degrees of freedom, typically in the actuation. So you might have a few actuators, but the actual relation to the state of the robot is ridiculously complex, right? So that's one issue. We do a combination. So if we can pre-train a reasonable model, like we did by walking the robot that I won't try to pronounce through the boxes, then in that case, we've got a pretty good idea that that pre-trained model is going to be good and usable, and then we can use it to learn online in the future. But we've also done plenty of things where we've just let the robots go off on their own and learn. If we can simulate it, then we can do it all offline. So the idea is that you simulate everything and then you transfer the controller again. But in reality, what you do is you simulate a bit and then you try and fit your simulator to the reality. So the robot itself has to be doing something. So we do stuff like that with robot arms, for example.
Does it learn when it's walking around as well, or is it stop learning that?
Oh, right, sorry, yes. Again, it depends on the representation. So I've done a lot of work with spiking networks, and they can vary their connection weights online as they go. So it's like you learn the network, but then what it actually does varies depending on what it experiences when it's out there. So that's one, but in general, we can just learn, like you'd learn a controller. You might learn a controller, you might implement PID or a game scheduler or Pulsar or whatever, but you can have a static controller that behaves reasonably well. The interesting research is in adaptive control. So we do both, and it depends, like, do we have enough time to investigate this, or do we need something that will work right now, kind of thing.
Awesome. Thank you, David. I think we'll end it there. Thanks so much for joining us.